The first light of dawn had barely touched the cotton fields when two very different mornings began unfolding on opposite sides of the Atlantic. In the American South, a veteran cotton farmer stood quietly beside his aging tractor, studying another season filled with rising costs, shrinking export opportunities, and growing uncertainty. Nearly 5,000 miles away, in Burkina Faso, a young farmer looked across freshly harvested cotton and wondered something entirely different. For the first time, he was not asking who would buy his harvest. He was asking whether his country could finally transform it with its own hands. What if the most important battle of the next decade is not fought with weapons, but with factories? What if the future of Africa is no longer hidden beneath gold mines, but woven from the very cotton growing across its fields? If you believe Africa deserves to build its own economic future instead of exporting it away, press like, share your thoughts below, and stay with us until the very end. Because this story is far bigger than cotton. For decades, Burkina Faso has been known as one of Africa's leading cotton producers. Every harvest represented the hard work of thousands of families. Yet, after the cotton left the farms, most of its real value was created somewhere else. Foreign factories spun the fibers into thread, turned the thread into fabric, and transformed the fabric into products sold around the world. The nation that grew the cotton often received only a small fraction of the final value. Today, many Africans believe that cycle should end. Reports and public policy discussions increasingly point toward a new economic direction, one focused on processing more agricultural products at home, expanding domestic manufacturing, and creating value before export. Supporters see this not simply as an economic adjustment, but as a question of dignity, opportunity, and long-term independence. Critics warn that such a shift could disrupt established trade relationships and create new commercial tensions. If Burkina Faso keeps more of its cotton at home instead of exporting it as raw material, who stands to gain, and who may have the most to lose? The answer begins with a quiet decision that could reshape not only one nation's economy, but also the future of African agriculture itself. The turning point did not begin with a dramatic speech or an overnight decree. It began with a question that many Burkinabe farmers had quietly asked for decades. Why should the country that grows one of Africa's most valuable cotton crops earn only a small share of the wealth created from it? That question has become increasingly important because Burkina Faso has long ranked among Africa's leading cotton producers. In strong harvest years, the country has produced well over 500,000 metric tons of cotton, with the crop supporting millions of people either directly or indirectly through farming, transportation, processing, and trade. Yet, despite this impressive production, much of the cotton has traditionally left the country as raw fiber. The higher value stages including spinning, weaving, textile manufacturing, and finished garments have largely taken place elsewhere. Every truck leaving Burkina Faso loaded with raw cotton carried something far more valuable than fiber. It carried jobs that could have been created locally. It carried technical knowledge that could have been developed inside the country. Most importantly, it carried away part of the value that Burkinabe farmers had already worked so hard to produce. For many African economists, this is not simply a cotton story. It reflects a broader development challenge across the continent, where countries often export raw materials while importing finished products at significantly higher prices. The result is that much of the value chain and many skilled manufacturing jobs remain outside Africa. Now, supporters of Burkina Faso's new industrial strategy believe that model can begin to change. Instead of exporting nearly everything in its raw form, the country has increasingly emphasized domestic value addition. Public discussions have focused on expanding local spinning facilities, encouraging textile production, supporting industrial investment, and creating manufacturing jobs before products leave the country. The objective is straightforward: produce locally, process locally, and capture more of the economic value at home. To many observers, this sounds like ordinary economic planning. To many Burkinabe citizens, however, it feels much more personal. In the city of Bobo Dioulasso, imagine a young technician named Musa. His father spent nearly 40 years growing cotton. Every season followed the same pattern: plant, harvest, sell. Watch the trucks disappear toward distant ports. His father often joked that the country's finest cotton returned home months later as expensive imported shirts that few local families could afford. Musa grew up believing that nothing would ever change. Today, he is training to operate modern textile equipment. For the first time, he sees the possibility that cotton harvested by his own community could become finished fabric inside Burkina Faso itself. That transformation represents more than industrial development. It represents confidence. Across villages and farming communities, conversations are gradually changing. Instead of asking only how much cotton will be harvested, people are beginning to ask another question. How many factories will process it? How many engineers will design new production lines? How many young graduates will find skilled employment without leaving their homeland? Those questions reveal why many supporters describe this moment as an industrial turning point rather than simply an agricultural reform. Naturally, such a transition also creates uncertainty. If more cotton remains inside Burkina Faso for domestic processing, traditional international buyers may need to adjust long-established supply chains. Companies accustomed to importing raw fiber could face higher costs or new sourcing decisions. Regional competitors may accelerate their own industrial strategies. International textile markets could gradually become more competitive if additional African countries expand manufacturing capacity. At the same time, another global story has been unfolding. American agriculture has faced multiple challenges in recent years, including changing export markets, supply chain disruptions, weather pressures, and uncertainty surrounding international trade relationships. Cotton producers in parts of the United States have also experienced periods of market volatility as global demand and trade conditions shifted. This creates an intriguing contrast. While some producers are working to protect existing export markets, Burkina Faso is increasingly discussing how to create entirely new industries around the crops it already grows. One conversation focuses on preserving established market access. The other focuses on building new domestic value. For many Africans, that difference carries symbolic weight. They are not simply asking whether cotton can generate more revenue, they are asking whether agriculture can become the foundation of industrial independence. Supporters of this vision argue that real sovereignty is measured not only by how much a nation produces, but also by how much of that production it transforms with its own workers, its own technology, and its own businesses. Yet every major economic transformation eventually meets resistance, competition, or unexpected consequences. If Burkina Faso continues moving further up the cotton value chain, how will international markets respond? Will trading partners adapt through cooperation? Or could commercial tensions emerge as established supply chains begin to shift? Because what happens next may determine whether this is remembered as a national industrial reform or the opening chapter of a much larger economic contest that reaches far beyond the cotton fields of Burkina Faso. As Burkina Faso's vision began attracting attention, another question quietly emerged far beyond West Africa. What happens when a country no longer wants to sell only its raw materials? For decades, the global cotton trade followed a familiar pattern. Cotton-producing nations harvested the crop, exported raw fiber, and imported finished products months later. It was a system built over generations, supported by international trading companies, textile manufacturers, shipping networks, and long-established supply chains. Changing that system would never be simple. Supporters of Burkina Faso's industrial ambitions argue that no country can build lasting prosperity by exporting nearly all of its raw resources while importing the finished goods at much higher prices. They believe the next stage of development requires keeping more value inside the country through manufacturing, technology, and skilled employment. But every economic shift creates new winners and new challenges. If Burkina Faso processes a larger share of its own cotton, international buyers may have less access to raw fiber than before. Textile companies that once depended on predictable supplies could face adjustments. Regional competitors may accelerate their own investments. Investors will watch closely to see whether Burkina Faso can deliver consistent quality, reliable infrastructure, and competitive production costs. None of these developments automatically lead to confrontation, yet they do create uncertainty. Trade history shows that whenever supply chains change, governments and businesses often respond by protecting their own economic interests. Sometimes those responses involve new investment partnerships. Sometimes they involve negotiations. In other cases, countries adopt tariffs, technical standards, or other trade measures to support domestic industries. At this stage, there is no confirmed evidence that Burkina Faso's cotton strategy has triggered a specific international trade dispute. However, analysts often discuss the possibility that significant shifts in value-added production could reshape future commercial relationships if more African countries pursue similar strategies. That possibility alone is enough to capture global attention. Imagine a boardroom inside a multinational textile company. Executives review production maps covering several continents. For years, Burkina Faso appeared mainly as a source of raw cotton. Now another possibility enters the discussion. What if Burkina Faso becomes a producer of yarn, then fabric, then finished garments? Suddenly, the conversation is no longer about purchasing agricultural commodities. It becomes a conversation about competing manufacturing industries. That is an entirely different economic landscape. Back in Ouagadougou, however, the conversation sounds very different. Young entrepreneurs are asking whether locally produced textiles can supply African markets before targeting Europe, Asia, or North America. University graduates are discussing engineering instead of migration. Small business owners are wondering whether domestic factories will create opportunities that never existed before. To them, this is not about challenging another country. It is about changing their own future. Across Africa, this debate touches a much deeper emotional question. For generations, many Africans have watched ships leave their ports carrying raw materials: cotton, cocoa, coffee, gold, timber, and countless other resources. Months later, finished products made from those same resources often returned carrying far higher price tags. Many now ask a simple question: if Africa grows the crops, why shouldn't Africa manufacture more of the products? That question has become increasingly powerful because demographics are changing rapidly. Africa has one of the world's youngest populations, with millions of young people entering the labor force every year. Supporters of industrialization argue that manufacturing can create skilled jobs, strengthen local supply chains, and reduce dependence on commodity price fluctuations. For them, cotton is no longer just agriculture. It becomes a symbol of moving beyond exporting raw potential, a symbol of building lasting economic capability. Meanwhile, the global economy continues facing uncertainty. Inflation, supply chain disruptions, geopolitical tensions, and shifting trade relationships have forced governments everywhere to rethink economic resilience. Countries increasingly discuss strategic industries, domestic production, and supply security. Burkina Faso's conversation therefore fits into a much broader international trend. Around the world, nations are asking similar questions. How much should we produce ourselves? How dependent should we remain on external supply chains? Which industries deserve long-term investment? Yet, Burkina Faso faces a challenge that may be even greater than building factories. It must convince investors, engineers, farmers, international partners, and its own citizens that this transformation can succeed over many years, not just through political speeches, but through consistent results. Factories must operate efficiently. Electricity must remain reliable. Roads and logistics must improve. Workers must receive technical training. Products must compete in international markets. These are enormous challenges, but history also reminds us that every industrial nation once faced similar doubts before proving what was possible. The real question is no longer whether Burkina Faso can harvest cotton. The world already knows it can. The question is whether Burkina Faso can build an entirely new economic identity from that same cotton, one that keeps more value, more innovation, and more opportunity inside Africa. Because if this strategy succeeds, it may inspire far more than one country. It could encourage an entire generation of African nations to ask a different question. Not, what can we export? But rather, what can we build? And if that question begins spreading across the continent, the next chapter may no longer be about Burkina Faso alone. It may become the beginning of Africa's own industrial awakening. If yarn becomes fabric, if fabric becomes finished clothing, then every additional step creates more jobs, develops more technical skills, supports more businesses, and keeps more economic activity within the country. That vision has inspired many young Africans, not because success is guaranteed, but because the conversation itself is changing. Instead of asking how much raw cotton can be exported this year, people are beginning to ask how many engineers can be trained, how many technicians can operate modern machinery, how many entrepreneurs can build companies that compete not only in Africa but around the world. Those questions represent something much larger than economics. They represent confidence. Confidence that African ideas, African workers, and African industries can create products that carry the label, Made in Africa. Across social media, universities, business forums, and public discussions, many Africans have expressed hope that industrial development can gradually reduce dependence on exporting unprocessed commodities. Others remain cautious, pointing to the significant investments, infrastructure, financing, and long-term planning required to make such ambitions succeed. Both perspectives recognize the scale of the challenge. Building factories is difficult. Building competitive industries is even harder. Reliable electricity, modern transportation, technical education, access to investment, stable institution, international partnerships. Each of these becomes part of the journey. No country transforms overnight. History shows that industrial development often requires patience measured in years rather than months. Yet every industrial economy once stood where Burkina Faso stands today. At some point, every manufacturing nation had to decide whether it would simply sell raw materials or invest in creating greater value at home. That decision always carried risks, but it also carried opportunity. Meanwhile, observers around the world are paying attention. International development organizations have increasingly emphasized the importance of value addition, regional manufacturing, and stronger African supply chains as part of long-term economic growth. Investors continue evaluating where new industries may emerge, while businesses monitor how regional markets evolve under initiatives such as the African Continental Free Trade Area. For international companies, Burkina Faso's ambitions present both opportunities and questions. Could partnerships help expand textile manufacturing? Could technology transfer accelerate industrial development? Could regional production create new markets for African-made products? These are questions that many businesses, economists, and policymakers are beginning to explore. In the United States, discussions about agriculture, manufacturing, and resilient supply chains have also become increasingly important in recent years. American farmers continue adapting to changing global markets, weather challenges, and evolving trade relationships. Businesses everywhere are seeking ways to strengthen production while remaining competitive in an interconnected world. From that perspective, Burkina Faso's aspirations are not isolated. They reflect a broader global conversation. Around the world, countries are asking how to create more domestic value, strengthen manufacturing, and provide opportunities for future generations. That does not mean every strategy will succeed, nor does it mean every country will choose the same path, but it does mean the conversation has become global. Back in Burkina Faso, however, the future is measured less by headlines than by ordinary people. Imagine a classroom where engineering students study textile technology instead of planning to leave the country. Imagine a farming cooperative negotiating with local manufacturers instead of relying entirely on overseas buyers. Imagine young designers creating clothing brands that proudly carry Burkinabe craftsmanship. Imagine trucks carrying finished products instead of only raw fiber. Those images may still represent aspirations more than reality, but history often begins with aspirations. Economic transformation is ultimately built by thousands of ordinary decisions. A teacher preparing students, an entrepreneur opening a workshop, a mechanic repairing industrial equipment, a farmer improving crop quality, a family deciding to invest in education. These individual stories rarely appear in international headlines, yet together they shape the future of nations. Across Africa, many people hope that future generations will inherit economies capable of creating greater opportunities at home, not because isolation is the answer, but because participation in global trade becomes stronger when countries contribute not only raw materials, but also innovation, manufacturing, and skilled labor. For many supporters, that is the deeper meaning of economic sovereignty. It is not about closing doors. It is about opening new ones. The future envisioned by many Africans is not one of confrontation. It is one of cooperation built on greater balance. A future where African farmers continue supplying world markets, while African factories increasingly create products that compete on quality, creativity, and value. A future where international partnerships become investments in shared prosperity rather than relationships based only on resource extraction. Whether Burkina Faso ultimately achieves every ambition remains uncertain. Economic development is never guaranteed. Markets change. Technology evolves. Governments change. Unexpected challenges appear. Success depends on consistent policy, capable institutions, private investment, education, innovation, and the determination of millions of citizens working together over many years. Yet even uncertainty cannot erase one remarkable fact. The conversation has changed. Young Africans are discussing industrial strategy. University students are discussing manufacturing. Entrepreneurs are discussing regional markets. Farmers are discussing value addition. That conversation alone represents progress, because every great transformation begins first in the imagination, then in the classroom, then in the workshop, then in the factory. Finally, it reaches the world. Perhaps years from now, historians will look back and debate exactly when Africa's industrial chapter truly began. Some may point to trade agreements. Some may point to infrastructure projects. Some may point to technological innovation. Others may remember the humble cotton fields of Burkina Faso and say they symbolized a growing determination to keep more value at home. Whatever history eventually decides, one lesson already stands out. Natural resources create opportunity. Human creativity creates prosperity. Machines can be imported. Factories can be built. But the greatest resource any nation possesses is the confidence of its people. When young people believe their future can be built in their own country, when farmers believe their harvest can support local industries, when entrepreneurs believe their ideas can compete internationally, hope becomes more than emotion. It becomes investment. It becomes innovation. It becomes action. And action is what changes history. So perhaps the real story has never been about cotton alone. It has always been about people. People who choose to imagine something larger than the circumstances they inherited. People willing to work patiently for a future that may take years to fully appear. People who understand that lasting prosperity is built one field, one factory, one classroom, and one generation at a time. If this story has given you a new perspective on Africa's changing economic future, we would love to hear your thoughts. Do you believe that creating more value from Africa's own resources can help shape a stronger future for the continent? Share your perspective in the comments below. Constructive dialogue helps us all better understand the opportunities and challenges that lie ahead. If you enjoy thoughtful analysis of African development, leadership, economics, and international affairs, remember to subscribe and join us for future discussions. Until next time, may God bless the people of Africa, the people of Burkina Faso, and all those around the world who work peacefully for justice, opportunity, mutual respect, and a more hopeful future. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in our next story.